What's up, chat? A lot of people really have no idea what the law even is and how it works in the United States of America. And I think it's a shame because once you get more in tune with what the law is, how the justice system works, you really understand how it's almost the invisible force that guides all of society. And it's important to understand how in theory it works and how in practicality it works. Now, in theory, it's pretty straightforward once you understand it. But that doesn't account for all the power, all the billions of dollars, all the political maneuvering and other things that affect the actual carrying out of the law. But for now, I would like to explain the theory of the law, the principles of laws, and how it should work in practice. And then from there, you could kind of understand how the different movers and shakers in society operate within the legal system to get what they want, to have the law on their side, to have the force and weight of government power on their side. Because the justice system is a branch of the U.S. government. The judicial system is the third branch of the government. We all know that, right? Okay, let's get right into it. The highest law of the land is the U.S. Constitution, all right? Now, there's three tiers of law. Constitutional law, which is also known as statutory law, same thing. Constitutional law, statutory law, same thing. Second tier is common law, also known as case law, okay? Not quite as powerful as statutory law. It is the second tier of law. And the bottom tier of law that carries the least amount of weight, the least amount of power, but is also used quite a bit by the state, somewhat secretly, is administrative law, okay? It's something that everything sleeps on. Administrative law is like DMV, EPA, all these different three-letter agencies. They create what is known as administrative law. Now, they don't really have the power to make law because the power to make law is granted in the Constitution to Congress, because you're supposed to be able to vote directly for the people that make the laws of the country. Now, we don't vote for these different agencies, so when they're making these rules and regulations that govern us, that is a constitutional issue. It takes away our democracy, it takes away our representation in government. But going back to the U.S. Constitution, right? The U.S. Constitution is the highest law of the land. It is the law that we must all abide by, and it is the law that all other laws must conform to. So, we all know what the U.S. Constitution is, right? You have the different, the Constitution was first written, was basically just setting up how government works, and then we had the Bill of Rights, our initial 10 Bill of Rights that give us, our rights as citizens. Okay, let's talk about specifically the Second Amendment. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Okay, this is a law, just like one of the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt not kill, all right? You can't break this law. Now, U.S. Constitution says you have the right to bear arms. Okay, now all 50 states, they cannot create a law that goes against the U.S. Constitution in any way, shape, manner, or form. Now, so let's say Joe Schmuck, right? Joe Schmuck buys an attack helicopter, and he invades his neighbor's property with his attack helicopter. And let's say this happened in the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia, right, they have their own court system that's specific just to the state of Virginia, and their highest court in the land is the Supreme Court of Virginia. Just like the highest court in the country is the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court in Virginia is the Supreme Court of Virginia. Right, now Joe Schmuck, he attacks his neighbor with an assault helicopter. His neighbor takes him to court. Now Joe Schmuck says, I didn't do anything wrong. I have the right to bear arms. This is in the Constitution. You can't take that right away from me. And let's say the lowest court in Virginia, which is, I believe, the district court judge is going to say, you know what? You're right. It's in the Constitution. You have the right to bear arms, shall not be infringed. You're right to have an attack helicopter. Right? Joe Schmuck's neighbor is a little bit upset, and he appeals that. So, basically, what the district court did by saying you can have an attack helicopter is he created what is known as case law or common law. And case law is not really a law. Like, nobody sat down and wrote the law. But case law is based off of statutes. So the statute says you have the right to bear arms. The judge interpreted it as okay, you could have an attack helicopter, and now you have case law that states people can have attack helicopters. Now, Joe Schmuck's neighbor, he's not too happy about that, so he appeals it to a higher court in Virginia, which goes up to the circuit court, and the circuit court judge says, well, the judge in the district court allowed you to have this, and I read the statute, you have the right to bear arms. Okay, I think it's fine. I think it's fine. You have the right to have an attack helicopter. Right now, Joe Schmuck's neighbor is really upset, and he appeals, and it goes to the Supreme Court of the state of Virginia. Supreme Court of the state of Virginia is the highest judge in Virginia, and he doesn't have to listen to any of the opinions of the lower judges. Why? Because they are in lower courts. They have less authority than he does. So he doesn't even care what the previous judges said, because they have no weight over him. Now, whatever he says, the lower judges have to go by, because he is the higher judge. So he says, you know what, that's a little bit ridiculous right now. You're saying that the U.S. Constitution gives you the right to have an attack helicopter. That's absolutely absurd. That's not what the framers of the Bill of Rights intended. This is meant for self-defense. It's not meant to have an attack helicopter. That's absolutely wild. And no, what Joe Schmuck did is absolutely wrong. He can't have that attack helicopter. He has to give it up. Right now that becomes the case law of Virginia. You can't have an attack helicopter. Right? And mind you, this is all based off of the Second Amendment in the Constitution. But it's different judges giving their interpretations, and the highest ranking judge's interpretation becomes the case law of the land. But now Joe Schmuck is a little bit upset, and he said, okay, you Virginia Judge Schmuck, I don't care about what you said. This is in the U.S. federal Constitution. I am a citizen of the United States of America, and you are taking away my constitutional right to attack helicopter. I literally read the Second Amendment. So they go to the Supreme Court, they go to the U.S. federal court system, because this is a U.S. constitutional issue. And although it was okay for Virginia to make their rulings on it, Joe Schmuck has a right to take it to the federal court system, because ultimately this is a constitutional issue, a U.S. federal constitutional issue. So again, we go through the whole process. The district court makes their ruling. This is the U.S. federal district court. And there's an appeal. It goes to the U.S. federal circuit court. There's another appeal. Now it's in the U.S. Supreme Court. And again, now the Supreme Court judges, right, the 9 Supreme Court judges, they're looking at it. They say, well, nothing that was said in Virginia matters, because this is the U.S. Constitution. We are the U.S. Supreme Court judges, and nothing that the state of Virginia has to say about our Constitution is relevant. Now, the district court made his ruling. Circuit court made her ruling, right? Hey, we read you guys' rulings, we looked at the reasoning, right? Yada, yada. But ultimately, the buck stops with us. We have to make a decision on it. And the Supreme Court says, no, you cannot have an attack helicopter. And now that becomes the law of the land that basically guides not only all federal law, but all state law, because this is a constitutional issue. The federal judges have the authority on federal issues. And if this is a constitutional issue, all the states have to abide by the ruling of the federal Supreme Court judge. Now, if this was something specifically related to a state law that wasn't addressed in the U.S. Constitution, then the state judges would have the final say. The Supreme Court of each state would have the final say on that state issue. But if it's a federal constitutional issue, such as freedom of speech, right to bear arms, etc., then it's a federal court judge, a Supreme Court judge, that gets the final say. Now, look at Roe v. Wade, okay? Look at Roe v. Wade was the law that said abortion, the government cannot make a law that takes away your right to abortion. Now, this was made by Supreme Court judges in the 1960s. But the issue was the Supreme Court judge has the authority to make law, not really law as in it wasn't written down and made by lawmakers, but law as in they can interpret previously existing law to be like, okay, yeah, you have the right to bear arms, but an attack helicopter is not what that law means. You can't have an attack helicopter. They have the right to interpret the law to that degree. But in Roe v. Wade, what they said was the U.S. government can make no law regarding abortion or preventing your right to get an abortion. Now, the The Supreme Court judges did not have that authority. They have the authority to interpret laws. They have the authority to make certain rules about court procedure, but they do not have the right to create law out of thin air. Now, the Supreme Court judges at the time made some sort of convoluted, twisted argument about privacy, and this invades your privacy rights. But even the only thing the Constitution says about privacy is, unlawful search and seizure, which has nothing to do with an abortion. So basically, these Supreme Court judges broke the law completely because they created law out of thin air when they do not have the authority to create that law. So when Roe v. Wade, whether you agree with it or not, was overturned, it was the right thing to do, because the powers that have law to make country, the powers in the country that have the right to make law is Congress, right? It's in the second article of the Constitution of the United States, and you can read it yourself. Basically, we live in a representative democracy, which is known as a republic, where you vote in people to represent you, and they get a vote on law. We don't vote in Supreme Court judges. Supreme Court judges are appointed by the president. So when the Supreme Court judges are creating law out of thin air, again, they are subverting democracy. Just like when these administrative organizations like the DMV start creating law, again, it is subverting democracy, because we're supposed to have direct representation in all the laws that are created in this country. So, going back to this Supreme Court case, right? Like Roe v. Wade, when that was overturned, basically what the judges said is, we don't have an authority to make law regarding abortion because we don't have the authority to make laws. So we can't prevent states from making laws about abortion because it's literally the Congress's job to make laws and not our laws. So to kind of bring everything together, common law or case law or Supreme Court precedents and all this is not the law of the land. What it is a judge interpreting a law that exists and making a ruling, applying it to the case at hand. And then the lower judges have to follow that judge's ruling. If it's a similar case and a similar issue, they have to follow the ruling of the higher judge. Now, if a Supreme Court judge, the Supreme Court judge is the highest judge in the country, but even those judges don't have to listen to previous Supreme Court judges, because the prior Supreme Court judges aren't any higher ranked than the current Supreme Court judges. So essentially, any case law that exists in the country can always be taken to the highest court of the land, which is, if it's a state issue, the highest court in the state. If it's a federal issue, the highest court in the Supreme Court in the country, and it could always be overturned because the highest judge in the land never has to listen to any prior precedent. So case law is much more wishy-washy than statutory law. And even though statutory law is wishy-washy to an extent because it can be interpreted by case law is much more wishy-washy because it's not really law. It's just rulings that prior judges made on prior cases. So for instance, like in 1798, maybe they said the most powerful weapon a citizen can own is a musket. In 2025, that doesn't really make much sense because we're living in a whole nother world, and you wouldn't use the application that judge made at that time. It wouldn't make sense. So case law can always be changed at any given time if it's a high enough ranking judge that could rule on the decision. Now, why is this important? Because none of us actually have any access to the Supreme Court. So if we're like a low ranking individual, you are just bound by this myriad of case law that exists. Hundreds of thousands of cases, and in every case the judges make decisions, and we're just bound by all those decisions. Now, if you're connected, you have a lot of money, you know the right lawyer, you could get your case to the Supreme Court, and you can basically have the law changed at any given notice to benefit you, right? And that's why we live in a country where the rich people control everything and the poor people control nothing. Because, they make it so hard to become a lawyer. They have all these gatekeepers so that these lawyers end up charging exuberant prices because the supply and demand of the lawyers is the supply is kept artificially low, which keeps the demand artificially high, which keeps the prices artificially high, which prevents poor people or even anyone except the rich people getting adequate access to the justice system in the United States. And that's a whole other subject altogether. But and now let me say one thing about statutory law. This is the bottom tier, least authoritative law in the country. again, things like DMV. And what happens is sometimes you get interest groups, right? These politicians are backed by interest groups, different lobbyists, and they want them to get something passed. But it would be unpopular for the congressman to vote on it to get that passed because it hurts the general public. So instead of voting on it and losing votes, they create these administrative agencies like the EPA and whatnot, and they have these administrative agencies create these rules and regulations, and nobody even ties it back to the congressman. So it's basically the government's way to create laws when they don't want to be held accountable for them. All right. Now, I hope this gave you some understanding of the legal system in America. There's so much more to talk about, but this is just kind of to have a base understanding. And another big thing to talk about is the law is actually pretty malleable, because there isn't nearly as much, like there is plenty of written law, and they pass these 1,200 page bills and stuff, but really a lot of the law in practice is being decided by judges on the floor, and there's so many gatekeepers to get you to those judges that it's really only the rich and powerful that could even get to the judge and have a decision in their favor. And then when they do get to the judge, the lawyer that they have hired is best friends with the judge, and then it's the lawyer and the judge coming together to fuck you.